The wooden hatch cover fit perfectly over the rectangular opening in Lucien Bouchard's cabin floor, and beneath it, orange firelight glowed from a chamber that shouldn't exist. Outside, the January wind howled at 20 degrees below zero, while inside, Lucien worked in his shirt sleeves, comfortable and warm, knowing that every other trapper within 50 miles was burning through their winter wood supply and still freezing. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The fire had burned all night. Lucien Bouchard knew this because he had woken twice to add wood, stoking the flames until they roared against the January cold. The cabin's stone fireplace radiated heat into the small space, and smoke curled upward through the chimney into the Montana darkness. Everything had been done correctly. The fire had not gone out. The wood had been dry, the chimney had drawn properly. And still, when dawn broke on January 12, 1849, Peter Van Horn was dead. Lucien found him in his bedroll near the wall, furthest from the fireplace. Peter's face was peaceful, almost relaxed, but his skin had the waxy pallor that came from cold. Not the dramatic freezing death of a man caught in a blizzard, but the quiet surrender of a body that had simply run out of warmth during the long hours between midnight and dawn. The fire still burned, the cabin still stood, but the cold had won anyway. They had been partners for 3 winters, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed into the Yellowstone River. Peter was Dutch, careful with money, meticulous about maintaining equipment. He had survived winters in the Rockies before. He knew how to dress, how to eat, how to prepare, and he had died anyway, 15 feet from a fire that never went out. Lucien sat beside the body for an hour as the sun rose, trying to understand what had happened. The fireplace was well built. They had constructed it the previous summer using river stones and clay mortar. It drew smoke efficiently and radiated heat into the room. But Lucien realized something as he sat there in the growing light. The heat went up. All was up. It rose from the flames, spread across the ceiling, and escaped through the inevitable gaps in the roof construction. The warmth pooled near the top of the cabin while the floor remained cold. A man sleeping on the ground, wrapped in blankets, existed in the coldest layer of air in the entire structure. He buried Peter that afternoon on a hillside, overlooking the creek they had trapped together. The ground was frozen, and it took 4 hours of work with a pickaxe to excavate a grave deep enough. Lucien marked it with stones arranged in a rectangle and spoke no words. There was nothing to say. A good man had died doing everything right, killed by a problem that nobody had solved. That night, alone in the cabin, Lucien could not sleep. He lay in his bedroll and felt the cold air against his face. Above him, near the ceiling, the air was warm. He could feel the temperature gradient, the way heat stratified in layers. The fire burned, the heat rose, the floor stayed cold, and men died. Lucien continued trapping through February, working the lines Peter had set before his death. But something had changed in how he observed the world around him. Every cabin he passed, every campfire he saw, became a study in heat and failure. He watched smoke rise from chimneys and disappear into the winter sky, carrying with it the warmth that men had worked to create. He saw trappers huddled close to fires, their faces red from heat while their backs remained cold. He noticed how quickly a cabin cooled once a fire died, how little warmth remained in the structure itself. He visited other trappers' camps during his rounds, men he traded with or simply encountered in the wilderness. Their cabins were built like his own, log walls chinked with mud or moss, a fireplace or fire pit, a single room with sleeping platforms or bedrolls on the floor. Some were better constructed than others, with tighter chinking or more substantial doors, but all of them operated on the same principle. Burn wood, create heat, watch it rise and escape. Fight the cold by constantly feeding the fire. In early March, Lucien came across an abandoned cabin near the confluence of two streams. The structure had been built 3 or 4 years earlier, judging by the weathering of the logs. Whoever had occupied it was long gone, leaving behind only the shell. Lucien spent an afternoon examining it with new attention to detail. He pulled up one of the floorboards and looked at the dirt beneath. Cold radiated upward from the earth. The ground was frozen solid, a reservoir of cold that pulled heat downward from anyone sleeping above it. He began sketching ideas in a leather journal he had taken from Peter's belongings. The drawings were crude, but they captured concepts. What if heat could be trapped below instead of allowed to escape above? What if the floor, instead of being the coldest part of the cabin, became the warmest? What if the earth beneath the cabin, instead of stealing heat, could store it? Other trappers noticed his distraction. A man named Remy Dufresne, who ran a trapline 12 miles south, stopped at Lucien's cabin in late March and found him sitting on the floor, staring at the boards beneath him. They talked briefly about beaver populations and spring weather, but Remy left shaking his head. Word spread quietly through the scattered trapping community. Bouchard had taken his partner's death hard. He was acting strange, obsessed with cabin construction, drawing pictures of things that made no sense. Lucien ignored the talk. He had identified a problem that killed men, and he believed there was a solution. Heat rose because hot air was lighter than cold air. That was a fact of nature, unchangeable. But what if you created heat below the living space and let it rise through the floor? What if you built a reservoir of warmth beneath a man's feet instead of above his head? The idea seemed simple, but Lucien had never seen it done. He had never heard of it being tried. That meant either it was impossible or nobody had thought of it before. Spring came late to the Montana high country in 1849. Snow lingered in shaded valleys through April, and the creeks ran high with meltwater. Lucien finished his trapping season in early May and sold his furs at a trading post on the Missouri River. He returned to his cabin in mid-May with supplies and a plan that would consume the next 4 months of his life. He began by removing floorboards, not all of them, just a section near the center of the cabin, away from the fireplace and the door. He selected an area approximately 4 feet by 3 feet and carefully pried up the planks, setting them aside intact. Beneath the floor, the earth was dark and slightly damp from spring moisture. Lucien marked out a rectangle on the exposed dirt and began to dig. The work was brutal. He excavated with a shovel and a pickaxe, removing dirt 1 bucketful at a time. The hole grew deeper each day, 2 feet down, 3 feet, 4 feet. He wasn't digging a cellar for food storage. He was creating a chamber, a specific shape for a specific purpose. The hole was 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and eventually 5 feet deep, large enough to hold a substantial fire, deep enough that the heat would be contained and controlled. Remy Dufresne rode past in early June and saw Lucien hauling dirt out of his cabin in a wooden bucket. He stopped his horse and called out, asking what Lucien was doing. Lucien explained he was digging a chamber beneath his floor to store heat. Remy stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. Not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. He told Lucien that if he wanted to dig a grave, he should do it outside where it would be useful. Then he rode on. Word spread quickly after that. Bouchard had lost his mind. He was digging a hole inside his cabin. He had some insane idea about heating from below. Other trappers made excuses to pass by and see for themselves. Some offered advice. Most just shook their heads and left. The consensus was clear. Lucien was wasting his time on something that would never work. Lucien ignored them and continued working. Once the chamber was excavated to full depth, he began lining it with stones. He hauled flat river rocks from the creek, selecting pieces that fit together tightly. He laid them along the bottom and up the walls, creating a stone-lined chamber that would contain fire without risk of the earth itself catching and smoldering. The stone would also absorb heat and radiate it slowly, creating thermal mass that would last through the night. The stonework took 3 weeks. Each rock had to be positioned carefully, fitted against its neighbors, and secured with clay mortar in critical spots. The result was an underground chamber that looked almost like a small stone room, accessible from above through the rectangular opening in the floor. Lucian built a small stone platform at one end where fire could be laid, elevated slightly to improve airflow and combustion. Lucian had no formal education in physics or engineering. He had learned basic carpentry from his father in Quebec, and he understood trapping, wilderness survival, and the practical skills required to stay alive in the mountains. But the problem he was trying to solve required him to think about heat in ways that most frontiersmen never considered. He began to conceptualize warmth not as something that simply existed or didn't exist, but as something that flowed, pooled, and could be controlled. Water flowed downhill and collected in low places. Heat flowed upward and collected in high places. But what if you created the heat in a low place and forced it to flow upward through a controlled opening? The underground chamber was his reservoir. The floor above was a barrier. The opening he had created was the controlled channel through which heat would flow. But that opening needed to be precisely sized and positioned, and it needed a way to regulate the flow. He measured the rectangular opening in his floor. It was 14 inches wide and 20 inches long. The dimensions had been determined by the spacing of the floor joists and the width of the floorboards he had removed. It wasn't arbitrary. A smaller opening might not allow enough heat to rise. A larger opening would be harder to cover and control, and it would create a safety hazard. Someone could fall through in the dark. The size felt right, but Lucien tested it anyway. He built a small fire in the underground chamber and stood above it, feeling the heat rise through the opening. The warmth came up in a steady column, spreading outward when it reached the cooler air of the cabin interior. He adjusted the fire size, adding wood and then reducing it, observing how the heat output changed. He noted that a moderate fire produced more consistent warmth than a roaring blaze. The chamber itself, lined with stone, absorbed heat and released it gradually. This thermal mass effect meant that even after the flames died down to coals, warmth continued radiating upward. But the opening needed a cover. Without one, heat would escape uncontrolled during the day when it wasn't needed. More importantly, the opening was dangerous. At night, a man could step into it and fall 5 feet onto stone and fire. Lucien needed a hatch that would seal the opening completely when closed, but could be opened in precise increments to control heat flow. He selected wood from a pine tree he had felled the previous year. The lumber had been seasoned for months, dried slowly in the shade of his cabin. He chose the densest, straightest-grained pieces he could find. The hatch needed to be thick, enough to withstand heat from below without warping, but light enough that he could lift it easily. He settled on 2.5 inches thick, using 3 boards edge-joined together to span the 20-inch width of the opening. The joinery was critical. He cut tongue and groove joints along the edges of each board, interlocking them so they would function as a single piece rather than 3 separate planks. He worked with a handsaw and chisels, taking his time to ensure the fit was tight. The hatch cover consumed 2 full weeks of work. Lucien understood that this single component would determine whether his entire system succeeded or failed. A poorly fitted cover would allow heat to escape around the edges, wasting the warmth he was trying to trap and control. A cover that warped under heat exposure would create gaps and eventually become unusable. A cover too heavy would be impractical for daily use. A cover too light would lack the structural integrity to remain flat over time. He shaped each board with a draw knife, removing material in thin curls until the surfaces were smooth and the thickness was consistent across the entire length. The 3 boards, when fitted together with their tongue and groove joints, created a panel that measured 22 inches wide and 16 inches long. This gave him a 1-inch overlap on all sides of the floor opening, ensuring the hatch would rest securely on the surrounding floorboards rather than dropping through the opening. The underside of the hatch, the surface that would face downward toward the heat, required special treatment. Lucien planed it perfectly flat and then sealed it with a mixture of beeswax and pine resin that he melted together over a low fire. He applied 3 coats, allowing each to dry before adding the next. The sealant would protect the wood from the drying effects of heat and would prevent cracking or warping. It also made the surface slightly water-resistant, important because condensation could form when hot air met the cooler wood. He cut a handle into the top surface, a rectangular recess 4 inches long and 1 inch deep, carved directly into the center board. The recess allowed him to grip the hatch and lift it without needing any metal hardware or protruding elements. The handle was simple but effective, and it kept the top surface of the hatch smooth and flush with the surrounding floor when closed. The fit between hatch and opening was where Lucien's obsessive precision became evident. He tested the hatch repeatedly, placing it over the opening and checking for gaps. He found spots where the overlap was uneven and planed those areas until the hatch sat perfectly level. He wanted the gap between the edge of the hatch and the edge of the opening to be minimal but not zero. Too tight, and the hatch would bind as the wood expanded slightly from heat. Too loose, and warmth would escape unnecessarily. After multiple adjustments, he achieved a fit where the hatch could be lifted easily but rested firmly when closed. The 1 inch overlap distributed the weight across the surrounding floorboards evenly. When closed completely, only a hairline gap remained visible around the perimeter. When lifted, the hatch could be propped at various angles, using small wooden wedges he carved for that purpose, allowing him to control airflow precisely. He tested the system for the first time on a cool June evening. He built a small fire in the underground chamber and placed the hatch over the opening completely closed. Heat had nowhere to go. He waited 10 minutes, then lifted one edge of the hatch approximately 2 inches using a wedge. Warm air flowed upward immediately through the gap, spreading across the cabin floor and rising into the room. Summer in the high country was brief and mild. Lucien spent the warm months preparing for the season that would test his invention. He stockpiled firewood, splitting and stacking cords of pine and fir near his cabin. He cut kindling and stored it in a dry corner inside. He repaired his trap lines, maintained his equipment, and waited for cold weather to return. By late September, the aspen leaves had turned gold, and frost touched the meadows each morning. The first serious cold snap arrived on October 9, 1849. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, falling from a comfortable afternoon warmth to well below freezing by midnight. Lucien had experienced dozens of nights like this during his years in the mountains. Normally, he would have kept a fire burning in his fireplace, adding wood every few hours through the night to maintain some warmth in the cabin. Sleep would be interrupted. Wood would be consumed steadily. Morning would arrive with the cabin cold again, requiring another fire to restore comfort. This night would be different. As darkness fell, Lucien opened the hatch cover completely and climbed partway down into the underground chamber using footholds he had carved into the stone wall. He built a fire on the stone platform he had constructed at one end of the chamber. He used dry kindling and small pieces of seasoned wood, arranging them carefully to ensure good airflow. The fire caught quickly and burned with steady flames. He climbed back up and adjusted the hatch, closing it most of the way, but leaving a 4-inch gap on one side. Heat from the fire below began rising immediately through the opening. He could feel it with his hand, a column of warm air flowing upward and spreading outward when it reached the cooler air above. The warmth didn't rise to the ceiling and disappear as it would from a traditional fireplace. Instead, it radiated outward across the floor, heating the wooden planks and creating a warm surface beneath his feet. Within an hour, the entire cabin felt different. The warmth was distributed evenly rather than concentrated near one wall. The floor itself was warm to the touch. Lucien sat at his small table and realized he was comfortable without sitting directly beside a fire. The heat rose from below, surrounding him, rather than hitting him from one direction. He added wood to the underground fire twice during the evening, climbing down to place larger pieces on the coals. Each time he adjusted the hatch position slightly, experimenting with different opening sizes to see how they affected heat output. A wider opening allowed more heat to escape quickly. A narrower opening slowed the heat release but maintained warmth longer. He found a position that felt optimal, with the hatch raised about 3 inches on one side. At midnight, he added a final large piece of wood to the fire and closed the hatch almost completely, leaving just a 1-inch gap. Then he lay down in his bedroll on the floor and slept. He did not wake to tend the fire. He did not shiver. He did not pull his blankets tighter against creeping cold. He slept through the entire night, without interruption. January 1850 brought cold that tested every structure in the territory. The temperature dropped and stayed below zero for 11 consecutive days. Trappers burned through their winter wood supplies at alarming rates, feeding fires constantly just to keep their cabins marginally habitable. Men wore their heavy coats indoors. Water froze in cups sitting 3 feet from active fireplaces. The cold was relentless and penetrating, finding every gap in every wall, stealing warmth faster than fires could produce it. Remy Dufresne had a solid cabin 12 miles south of Lucien's location. He was an experienced woodsman, careful about preparation. He had stockpiled sufficient firewood and knew how to maintain a fire through harsh conditions. But on the 9th night of the cold wave, his cabin became uninhabitable despite his best efforts. He fed his fireplace continuously from sunset until well past midnight, burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply weeks before spring. The fire roared. The flames were hot enough to make the stones glow. And still, the temperature inside his cabin hovered barely above freezing. At 2 a.m, Remy made a decision that likely saved his life. He banked his fire, grabbed essential supplies, and left his cabin. He rode his horse through darkness and brutal cold toward Lucien's place, knowing it was his closest option for shelter. The 12-mile journey took nearly 3 hours. When he arrived just before dawn, he was shivering violently and struggling to dismount. Lucien heard the horse and opened his door. He was in his shirt sleeves, comfortable. Remy stared at him, confused. The difference was immediately apparent. Lucien's cabin radiated warmth even with the door open. Remy stumbled inside and stood on the wooden floor, feeling heat through his boots. He looked around for a massive fire and saw none. The small fireplace in the corner held only dying coals. Lucien closed the door and gestured to the floor near the center of the cabin. Remy noticed the rectangular hatch cover for the first time. Lucien lifted it partially, revealing the orange glow from below and releasing a wave of warmth. He explained the system simply. Underground chamber, single fire, heat rising through controlled opening, stone thermal mass holding warmth through the night. Remy knelt beside the opening and felt the heat radiating upward. He walked around the cabin, touching walls, checking corners. Everything was warm, not just tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. He asked Lucien what the temperature difference was compared to outside. Lucien didn't know exactly, but estimated at least 40 degrees, possibly more. As dawn broke, Remy sat at Lucien's table drinking hot coffee and recalculating everything he thought he knew about surviving mountain winters. His cabin, with its conventional fireplace and constant wood consumption, had failed completely. Lucien's cabin, with its strange underground fire that burned a fraction of the wood, maintained warmth effortlessly. The difference wasn't minor, it was the difference between survival and death. Remy stayed at Lucien's cabin for 2 days while the extreme cold persisted. During that time, he studied the underground heating system with the careful attention of a man whose life might depend on understanding it. Lucien answered every question and demonstrated how the system operated. He showed Remy how to regulate heat by adjusting the hatch position, how to build the fire for maximum efficiency, and how the stone lining of the chamber absorbed and released warmth gradually. The principle was simpler than Remy had expected. Cold air was heavy and sank. Hot air was light and rose. By creating heat below the living space, Lucien had reversed the normal problem of cabin heating. Instead of fighting against physics by trying to push warm air downward from a fireplace, he worked with physics by allowing warm air to rise naturally through the floor. The heat didn't pool uselessly at the ceiling. It started at the floor and filled the entire space evenly. The thermal mass was equally important. The stone-lined chamber absorbed heat during active burning and released it slowly over hours. A fire that burned hot for 2 hours would keep the chamber warm enough to radiate heat for 6 or 8 hours after the flames died. This meant Lucien could sleep through the night without tending the fire, something impossible with a traditional fireplace that required constant feeding. Remy asked about wood consumption. Lucien estimated he was burning 1/3 the amount of wood he had used in previous winters with conventional heating. The underground system was vastly more efficient because almost no heat escaped unused. Everything produced by the fire either radiated into the cabin immediately or was stored in the stone mass for later release. When the cold wave finally broke on January 21st, Remy returned to his own cabin and immediately began planning modifications. He asked Lucien if he would help with the excavation and construction. Lucien agreed without hesitation. He had no interest in keeping the technique secret. If other men could survive winters more safely because of what he had learned, that seemed reason enough to share it. They spent a week in February digging the chamber beneath Remy's cabin floor. The work went faster with 2 men, but it was still substantial effort. Excavating 5 feet down through partially frozen earth, hauling away the dirt, lining the chamber with stone, cutting the floor opening, and building a fitted hatch cover required careful execution. But when finished, Remy had a functioning system identical in principle to Lucien's design. Word spread organically through the scattered trapping community during the spring of 1850. Men talked at trading posts and chance encounters on trap lines. Bouchard had built something that actually worked. His cabin stayed warm with minimal wood. The crazy hole he had dug turned out to be genius, not madness. Other trappers began asking questions, and a few, convinced by Remy's testimony, began planning their own underground heating systems before the next winter arrived. By the fall of 1850, 3 more trappers had built underground heating systems modeled on Lucien's design. Bastien Girard, who worked a trapline 40 miles northwest, excavated a chamber beneath his cabin in August and September. He made modifications based on his specific situation, creating a slightly larger chamber and positioning his floor vent closer to his sleeping area. The principles remained the same, but Bastien adapted the details to fit his needs and available materials. Cornelius Dekker, a Dutch settler who had claimed land in a valley east of the trapping territories, heard about the system from a trader passing through. Dekker had a wife and 2 young children, and the prospect of keeping them warm through winter without burning excessive wood appealed to him immediately. He traveled to meet Lucien in October and spent 3 days observing the system in operation and asking detailed questions about construction. Dekker returned home and built his chamber with help from his older brother. His version included 2 floor vents instead of 1, positioned at opposite ends of his cabin to distribute heat more evenly through the larger family space. Each vent had its own hatch cover, allowing independent control. The dual-vent design worked well for his situation, though it required more careful fire management to prevent overheating one section while underheating another. The variations that emerged demonstrated something important about Lucien's innovation. It wasn't a rigid formula that had to be followed exactly. It was a principle that could be adapted to different cabins, different climates, and different needs. Some men built smaller chambers for single-room trapper cabins. Others built larger systems for family dwellings. Some used only stone lining, while others experimented with clay brick or fire-hardened earth. The core concept remained constant: create heat below, store it in thermal mass, release it upward through controlled openings. During the winter of 1850 to 1851, the benefits became undeniable. Men with underground heating systems reported using half to one-third the firewood of previous years while maintaining superior comfort. They slept through nights without waking to tend fires. Their cabins maintained stable temperatures even during extreme cold. The difference wasn't marginal, it was transformative. A phrase began circulating among trappers and settlers in the region. When describing a particularly well-built or warm structure, men would say it was warm as Bouchard's floor. The expression stuck because it captured something specific and memorable. It wasn't just warm, it was warm in a particular way, heated from below, steady and reliable, rather than fluctuating wildly like traditional fireplace heating. Lucien heard the phrase used for the first time in the spring of 1851 at a trading post. Two men were discussing cabin construction, and one mentioned that his new place would be warm as Bouchard's floor if he built it right. Lucien said nothing, but he understood that his solution to a problem that had killed his partner had become part of the collective knowledge of the frontier community. The technique would persist because it worked, shared freely among men who needed it to survive. Lucien Bouchard continued trapping until 1857. He was 43 years old that year, older than most men who still worked the mountain trap lines. His body carried the accumulated wear of hard winters and physical labor. His hands were scarred from decades of skinning knives and steel traps. He had survived longer than Peter, longer than many others who had come to the mountains seeking fortune or freedom. But he recognized that his time in the wilderness was ending. He sold his trapline and equipment to a younger man from Pennsylvania and left the mountains in the fall of 1857. He settled in a small town in western Montana Territory, buying a modest house with money he had saved over the years. He lived quietly, working occasionally as a carpenter when someone needed skilled joinery or repair work. He married a widow named Claire Moreau in 1859. They had no children, but Claire had a daughter from her first marriage, and Lucien became a steady presence in the girl's life. He never spoke much about his years in the mountains. When people asked, he described trapping and wilderness living in general terms, but rarely mentioned specific innovations or achievements. The underground heating system that had spread through the frontier community wasn't something he discussed. It had been a practical solution to a problem, nothing more. He saw no reason to claim credit or draw attention to it. Lucien died in March 1872 at the age of 58. Pneumonia took him over the course of a week. He was buried in the town cemetery under a simple granite marker that listed his name, birth year, and death year. The stone made no mention of trapping, cabin construction, or heating innovation. To anyone reading it, he was simply another frontiersman who had lived and died in the territory. But in the mountains he had left 15 years earlier, his original cabin still stood. The logs had weathered to gray, and the chinking required occasional maintenance, but the structure remained solid. A trapper named August Werner occupied it through the 1860s and into the 1870s. Werner used the underground heating system exactly as Lucien had designed it, burning fires in the stone-lined chamber and controlling heat flow through the rectangular floor vent. The system functioned perfectly decades after its construction. Other cabins built with underground heating continued operating throughout the region. Some were maintained and improved by new occupants. Others were abandoned as the frontier shifted and people moved on. But the empty structures stood as evidence of a technique that had solved a fundamental problem. Settlers moving into the area in the 1870s and 80s discovered these cabins and recognized their superior design. A few learned the principles and built similar systems in new locations. The knowledge persisted not because anyone promoted it, but because it worked. Men facing brutal winters adopted techniques that kept them alive. Lucien's solution, born from tragedy and refined through obsessive effort, became part of the practical wisdom of the frontier, outlasting the man who created it.